I thought I'd start with a Halloween theme, monitoring nightmares. So basically this talk's going to be about some of the market research we did on the basically the monitoring landscape and the problems out there. And the reason we did this, okay, can I outsource the clicking to someone if I say next slide? Okay, next slide. Okay, wait, we're next slide already. Not the next slide, keep it there. Okay, okay, so just a bit about our background. So we, the founders of Dataloop.io, we all met at a company called Alfresco. It's the world's leading open source document management company. I was in charge of the enterprise cloud business, and Stephen was an operations guy, like many of you, who'd been doing it for 12 years, launched 6 online services. And basically, we all came together to launch Alfresco's online service, and the problem we had was monitoring. You know, it was a big pain in the ass for us. We basically had to build this sea of red just to monitor the stuff in blue. It was a lot of components. It took us about 6 months to kind of put all these pieces together, get it all working together, tuning, all that kind of stuff. And so actually, we actually had a name for it. We called it the, oh, fuck. Okay, next slide. We called it the Franken monitor. So essentially, it was just a lot of components put together till we get all the visibility across the entire stack, from the user metrics all the way down to the infrastructure. Next slide. So Stephen, back in March last year, was like, hey, let's start a monitoring company. Let's go and build another monitoring tool that solves this problem. And you can see from here, we look like The Apprentice. So so basically, the first thing, though, was, next slide, was, well, you know, 2011, everyone was talking about monitoring sucks. There's been a lot of progress since 2011. Like, so what, you know, like, why do we need to launch another online, you know, why do we need to launch another monitoring company? Is there really still problems in this space? Are companies having the same issue we had at Alfresco? So, and the reason we cared about that was because, you know, we don't want to quit our jobs and then basically be, you know, unemployed in like 6 months' time building something that no one gives a shit about. So we did a lot of customer validation, and we went out and we tapped our network, and these are just a few of the companies we've spoken to. Some of them we spoke to after we did the kind of market research, but we've probably spoken to about 100 companies now. But you can see we've spoken to many of the largest online services. We've also spoken to a bunch of startups as well. So we've had a very broad view of basically understanding what people are doing in the monitoring space. And then what happened in February was I wrote a blog called What We Learned About Monitoring from 60 Companies. Has anyone read this blog? Okay, a couple of people. So this actually got us a lot of traffic and quite a bit of attention from a lot of monitoring people who care about monitoring with all our research of what we basically found. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and some of the problems that we see consistently when we go and speak to different companies. So the first thing was, you know, trying to understand what everyone's using. Like, was everyone using this stack we were using at Alfresco or a similar stack? So at Alfresco, we're using OpsView, which is a kind of package of Nagios. We're using Graphite. We're using StatsD. We're using, like, you know, a lot of the kind of typical tools out there. And resoundingly, 50% of the people we speak to have, you know, are pretty much using Nagios. Nagios is still dominant. How many people here are actually using Nagios? So you can see, pretty much 50% of the room. I mean, it's still there, it's still incumbent. Everyone says it's shit, but it's still being used, you know, quite extensively. And, you know, it was quite interesting that if you take up to the kind of Graphite graph, like about 80% of organizations are using open source stuff, like Zabbix and Nagios and that kind of stuff. And then in the other column, that's not just like other with like all these little small monitoring tools that you may never have heard of, because there are a lot of people out there doing monitoring. It was actually quite a large chunk of people who had actually custom built stuff from scratch. Like I'm saying, like taking OpenTSDB and then building custom front ends on top of it, building custom metric collection. So there's a lot of people, about 90% of the people we spoke to had done some significant effort building monitoring. So that kind of gave us a bit of confidence. And then we kind of broke it up and saw like, well, what types of companies are using what? So it kind of makes sense at the lower end, like the smaller startups, you know, like the less than 20 servers. People are generally using some of the kind of newer tools and the SaaS tools because they're quite young, and generally they're kind of run by developers. So developers don't really want to use Nagios and all these things, so they kind of go out and use things like Datadog or whatever. So at that end, you know, you see a lot of SaaS tools. But as you get to the larger end, what we kind of see, if we kind of aggregated our view of how we see the history of most online services is we seem to see like a tipping point around 50 to 100 servers. They're hiring their first ops guy who comes in to help manage the service. And then that's when Nagios and Sensu and all these other tools start appearing, because now the ops guys have to worry about monitoring. When it's just developers, they tend not to kind of set up much themselves. It tends to just be online tools or simple tools for kind of monitoring, or New Relic is their monitoring tool. So that was quite interesting, and as you can see as well, with the more expensive tools like Splunk, obviously the bigger services can afford it, the smaller ones can't, so that's why they're using that. So that's how we kind of saw it. Next slide. So when we walk into a lot of organizations now, this is pretty much what I would define as a typical stack. Probably 80% of the companies we go into have this form of stack or something similar to it. So most of the people we speak to are using Amazon Web Services, public cloud. They've got some combination of New Relic. They maybe just be using it on a couple of servers because it's quite expensive. But they've got something in there just for kind of some APM. They've got an Elk stack, for kind of doing their log monitoring. They've got Pingdom for kind of external up and down monitoring, and then they've got Nagios and Graphite, or maybe Zabbix instead of Nagios. And this for us is pretty typical from what we see when we go and talk to most of the companies we speak to. And actually what we're seeing, if you go back, what we're actually seeing as well is a few companies are now starting to adopt dashing. Does anyone not know what dashing is here? That was a double negative. Okay, cool. So basically, it's a popular framework. We see this quite increasingly in a lot of companies using dashing for kind of building kind of TV dashboards around their organization. It's pretty cool. So, okay. Yep, next slide. So what did we take away from this? We did a lot of customer interviews. We spoke to a lot of organizations. What were the problems that need to be solved in this space, either by us or the open source community? And the first thing we saw was basically, most people are still custom building a lot of monitoring tools. Like typically, for a lot of, especially the larger services, we're looking at 4 to 6 months of development in terms of, spread out over time in combination with all the other stuff they're doing in terms of releases and deployments and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of significant investment in everyone kind of building a custom monitoring tool. And we call it the kit car because it's essentially taking all these different components and then piecing them together and then tuning them and then getting to work with continuous delivery and all the other things which some of these tools weren't designed to do originally. And then the other problem they have, so they spend this time building this monitoring solution and then they get to the point where it's like, okay, now our service is taking off and now they've got to scale it. Graphite's great when you've got like maybe tens of thousands of metrics going in, but once you start pumping in hundreds of thousands of metrics and you start storing that for a year and all this kind of stuff, it's a bitch to cluster. It's really hard to kind of start scaling. Nagios, one example, one of the organizations we spoke to used Zabbix, which is a pretty cool tool, but it uses MySQL in the back end, and they pretty much let their MySQL database grow to 2 terabytes, which basically meant that Zabbix stopped working. So their only solution to that was to basically just drop the table and lose all their metrics. So this is the kind of issues you start hitting once you start getting to scale. So these two issues combined, what do we actually think the solution is for this? I mean, we may be biased, but use a SaaS tool basically. Whether it's us or someone else, basically we don't believe the value in monitoring is managing additional infrastructure and worrying about scaling it and making sure it works and all that kind of stuff. Your monitoring system is supposed to be more more available than the service you're monitoring, otherwise it's not decent monitoring. And for most people, they're running Graphite on a single server, they're running Nagios on a simple server. that server goes down, you've lost your monitoring. It doesn't typically scale unless you put a lot of investment into it. So I honestly think, and I would, of course, SaaS, in terms of the infrastructure for just collecting metrics, graphing the metrics, and alerting off the metrics, that stuff has been solved by SaaS vendors. I would just outsource that stuff and concentrate on the more important things like getting DevOps processes in and deployments and so forth. So the other thing that we also saw a lot of is, okay, what happens when you start collecting loads of metrics? So now, some of the organizations we speak to are collecting hundreds of thousands of metrics. So one of our customers, British Gas Hive Home, they collect 400,000 metrics, a minute, and that's just, pretty much from installing collectd and just putting that against all their services and stuff. So it's very easy to start ramping up the number of metrics you're collecting. And there is a mantra out there in the monitoring space about collecting everything, because you can't go back in time and see stuff if you haven't collected it. But the thing is when you start collecting loads and loads of metrics, which ones should you care about? When you've got like 100,000 metrics coming in, which are the ones that actually tell you when something's going wrong? Which are the ones which are important and leading indicators for issues you can have on the site? So there are some people like playing in this space. So does everyone here know Skyline? Yeah, a few people. So Skyline's another tool from Etsy, who have done quite a few monitoring tools. So Skyline is basically for anomaly detection. So anomaly detection is using machine learning to basically figure out which of the metrics out there are the important ones, which are the anomalous ones. So you don't have to start basically monitoring everything and looking at it every day. The system will tell you what it is. The issue we see with this space at the moment is we've tried Skyline with some of our customers. We've tried some of the other tools as well that have anomaly detection. The anomaly detection out there is pretty dumb right now. And the reason is because the metrics coming in have no context. The system doesn't know if this is a CPU metric, if it's a memory metric, or if it's a disk metric. It can't really do anything with those metrics without the context around it. There is a project called Metrics 2.0, if you guys have heard of that. It's an open source project where they're basically trying to define a standard for putting metadata around your metrics, so the computer can start figuring out a little bit more about your metrics. But most people aren't using that. So in the meantime, anomaly detection basically, in our example, 400,000 metrics, we found like well over 1,000 anomalies. And then of course, what are you going to do with 1,000 anomalies? You're not going to go in and start looking for every single one. It doesn't really, all it does is just filter down 100,000 to 1,000. It doesn't really help. So we think this still has a long way to go, but this is at least a start in the right direction. This is probably going to be the solution longer term. The other thing, who doesn't suffer with this problem? Okay, pretty much. This is still a huge problem. To give you one example, one of these services that we spoke to, they basically get 5,000 email alerts a day. And essentially, that's pretty much just noise. They can't look at 5,000 emails every day, so their response to basically knowing if there's an issue on the service is essentially if they get more emails than usual, there's probably something wrong with the service. That's not really proper monitoring. And that is probably the extreme example. We haven't seen that anywhere else, thank God. But this is a really big problem. And this is the way we kind of view like how we think monitoring should be solved by the tools out there. If you go to, back. So basically, a lot of monitoring systems out there today pretty much just alert you as soon as a check goes off. They don't give you a simple way for you to kind of define what are the actionable metrics that you need to, the ones you actually care about. So we believe, you should only be sending alerts for actionable metrics and whichever tool you're using. If they're not actionable, there's no point getting woken up about them. The other thing as well is we honestly believe a few tools in the SaaS space are starting to do this. We're doing it ourselves as well, is alert rules. So multi-condition alert rules. So right now, every monitoring system out there is pretty much is kind of like, alert goes off, fire an email. It's like a burglar alarm going off in a shop. The alarm trips, the burglar alarm goes off. But if you're a human being in that shop, you'd probably check before you phone the police. Is the glass broken? Is the are the lights switched on? Is anyone moving around? So you'd check for other conditions, other angles to kind of see if it's a real alert or if it's just like the alarm going off by itself. Most monitoring tools today are just the former. They just basically fire off an alert when something goes wrong. And by using multi-condition alerts, you can essentially say, well, if this alert goes off, then only alert me if this and this also have failed as well. So the disk space has run out, plus the memory's gone up, whatever the conditions are, that that you would probably check yourself manually when an alert goes off to make sure it's a real alert. And that can drastically reduce the number of false positives you get from your monitoring system. The other thing as well is you shouldn't have to handle every single alert that comes in your system. Some of these things are things that could just be put as Jira tickets. So Sensu has a concept of alert handlers. We also use that in Data Loop, where you can basically custom script what happens with that alert when things come in. So it could be disk space is running out, just automatically clear out the temp directory, roll the logs. Why do you have to wake up and fix that if a computer script could do that for you? Some people don't trust that, but I think over time, at least being able to put alerts into an automated fashion, like put them into Jira or something like that, at least that's a start. So you're not responding to loads and loads of emails. And finally, configurable nagging. A lot of people just have nagging switched on, which is the kind of default method settings. So essentially, not only do you get an alert when it goes off, you get an alert every single time the check runs. And then essentially, instead of getting one email for that one alert, you end up with like 20, 50 emails or whatever, however long it takes for you to kind of respond to that alert. So that's something that you can probably do today just on your existing monitoring solution, just to reduce the number of spammy alerts. So one of the things, being a DevOps meetup, we're all interested in faster deployments and continuous delivery. So, essentially, someone put that monitoring is the immune system of continuous delivery. You know, it's a thing there to catch anything that's managed to get through all your automated tests and get a system in production to make sure that you don't have any issues in production. And the issue of continuous delivery that we've seen with monitoring is things are changing much, much faster. So from the extreme example, taking Amazon, they're doing 20,000 releases a day. Obviously, that's not just for one of their sites, that's across all their different services. But, you know, most of us are doing at least one release a week. You know, some of us are doing several a day. And each time you're doing release, you're changing systems, you're changing the service. And if you're not updating your monitoring configuration in line with that, then things are going to get out of date pretty quickly, and you're going to start getting spammy alerts not because the system's down, just because something's changed. So in terms of this, really this is all about automation. I also will link it back later to self-service monitoring, where developers can set up their own kind of alerts and everything. But I think the key for this one is automation. So basically using configuration management to roll out your checks, and making sure you tag all the boxes to the right checks get delivered to the right boxes using automation. The goal here, as we've seen in our own experience, is you want to minimize the time and the complexity to add and edit checks and alerts in the system. So the issue we see today, and we had this problem at Alfresco, is if it takes you half an hour to go in and kind of, you see a check's failing, then you have to kind of test it, then you have to kind of wait for the next Puppet run to push it out and all that kind of stuff. If that's like a 15-minute round trip, you're going to procrastinate on it. You basically will say, well, that alert's not too important. I'll come back to it when I have time. I've got to work on this first. And then you end up with all these kind of red blotches everywhere in your monitoring system because everyone's falling behind with kind of keeping things up to date. What we actually did in dataloop.io, which is quite unique, is we actually let you go into the browser and edit the scripts and basically test it remotely inside the browser, drag it into a group of servers, and it's deployed. So we've minimized the round trip of kind of fixing and creating things to a few seconds. And the reason we think it's important is for exactly this reason. If you're changing your service in a very fast pace, you want to be able to change your monitoring configuration at a similar rate. And you don't want to have those barriers to let people procrastinate on fixing alerts and monitoring checks. Another issue that we've seen in a lot of organizations is data silos. So there's kind of two ways of looking at this. One is most monitoring tools have been built for ops, and ops own those monitoring tools. So all that data which you guys are collecting tends to get locked in the operations team. And it's a shame because some of these metrics are like really important, like stuff that the business would care about, like SLAs and all this other stuff that they care about. So that's kind of one issue. The other issue is you end up, as we've seen in some organizations, they end up basically rolling out Graphite servers to lots of different teams. So now they don't have a holistic view of their entire service. They have lots of different pockets of Graphite with collecting different metrics about the service. And then they do another project, which is then like an Uber Graphite that sucks in the metrics from all of those. And that's we've actually seen that in one organization. And so you end up with this data silo issue. And like I said, the data silo issue was actually a big factor for us why I got excited about monitoring at Alfresco. So we had an issue where we're an on-premise company switching to cloud. The engineers weren't used to running an online service. There were issues in the service which we needed kind of resolved. The operations team was saying we need to fix this and blah, blah, blah. And the engineers were like, yeah, that's low priority. We need to get this new feature out. As soon as we showed them, got the metrics about some performance issues around some of the services, some of the nagging issues we had, for running the service, all of a sudden it was like within a week, And actually there were a couple of things we did to kind of get that executive buy-in as well to help those changes go through. One was we created really nice dashboards. So this is actually a DataLoop dashboard, but essentially we basically put these up on plasma screens around the office, and that basically gave us visibility. So now people in the office could basically look around and basically see what the ops team were doing and how the service was performing, because if you're an online company, everyone cares about the service. But the other thing we also did, this was the killer one, was we wrote this very brittle Ruby script that every Monday would collect all the key metrics from Graphite and Nagios and essentially put them into a kind of email. And that email would say, what are we spending on Amazon this week versus last week? How many signups this week versus last week? But most importantly, all the Graphite performance measures. How long was our search taking? How long were the logins taking? All that kind of stuff. We had those all in graphs at the bottom. And so we had an issue around search. It was some really abysmal performance because of a bug in it. And we basically spent must have been months basically trying to fix that. And as soon as we had that email going out to the executive team, and I could point to them in the executive meeting, because they're never going to log into our monitoring tools. They're never going to go into Graphite and look at it. But they will look at an email that's sent to their inbox. All of a sudden, it was like, look at this. This needs to be fixed. And they were like, shit, yeah, that needs to be fixed. And a week later, we had it fixed. This is like, you know, the power of unlocking all these metrics and getting them into the front of business stakeholders and other teams outside operations. And then the final thing is open API. Obviously, without an API, it makes it difficult for other people to pull in those metrics and build their own reports and stuff. Okay. Who here is doing microservices? Who here doesn't know what microservices are? Okay, so a couple of hands. So that's about. So what we're seeing is we're seeing an increasing number of services moving to microservices. Microservices isn't just a software architecture, it's also, I guess, a cultural architecture around your online service. So in the example of Just Eat, who use microservices, Spotify is also a very good example, they talk about this. You basically break up your service into these different services. So one service is for billing, one's for kind of orders, and one's for analytics and one for notifications. But it's not just a service being built in this service-oriented architecture, it's also the product teams organized around these different services. So one product team may own a couple of services, and they're responsible for deploying it, for supporting it, and for monitoring it. So you're kind of devolving responsibility down from the operations team that traditionally does the deployments and supports the service, down to different teams in the organization. And the reason that's really important is because it helps you scale. You know, like there's no way Netflix and Just Eat and Spotify could scale their organization without using microservices. Maybe there's another way, but this seems to be the adopted way. And so it really does create a different challenge in terms of monitoring. You know, most ops tools, like I said previously, are designed for operations. They're not designed to be devolved down to lots of different teams. And then the other issue, again, is around adoption. So we really spend a lot of time trying to get developers trying to use our monitoring tools. Like, you know, so Graphite, usually that's quite a quick win because they can just pump in their own metrics and, you know, build their own graphs. But getting them to kind of, you know, help us with Nagios check scripts or, you know, kind of rolling out, you know, other checks and stuff via Nagios, that was a bitch. They never wanted to use it. They didn't care about it. Even New Relic, we actually bought New Relic. We switched to App Dynamics because they never used New Relic. So we thought, well, App Dynamics is more for ops, so we'll use it. So we got App Dynamics. But yeah, getting adoption on monitoring solutions, especially some of the older kind of tools, is really hard, especially when you start going outside operations to developers, maybe support, QA, maybe even business stakeholders who want to see key metrics in your system. So really the solution here, this is where we think the monitoring space is going and should be going, in our opinion, is self-service monitoring. So it's not just the operations team that own the monitoring and have access to kind of setting up the metrics and the check scripts and the dashboards, but it's to kind of giving those tools as a self-service solution to other teams in your organization. And in the microservice model, this is critical. There's no way you could run microservices without giving developers their own self-way to kind of write their own checks, get their own alerts, and set up their own dashboards. And really, in terms of kind of criteria for these things, you know, it has to have a nice UI. You know, most people hear ops or developers, like ops. Yeah, most people. So I used to be a developer, so you know, I know from experience, you know, we like shiny things, and we need to have nice UIs. And basically it has to be really simple. If you start putting manuals and Wikipedia pages of like how to write a new check script and how to roll it out to production and blah, 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 and it's 20 steps long or whatever, you know, you're not going to get developers owning it. And then what's going to happen is they're going to say, we need to check this, we just put a new service in production. By the way, here's a Jira ticket, can you do it when you have time? You know, really you want to be giving that to developers so they can do their own checks and their own stuff. And the key thing that we don't see in any of the tools right now, which we're, other than Data Loop right now, is the account model. So in a microservices model, the operations team are kind of the you know, own the kind of overall service and the kind of processes and all the DevOps tools and automation that go into that service. They still need to have full visibility across the entire service. However, the different teams, you don't want the different teams going in and setting up different Nagios check scripts maybe on different parts of the servers that they don't have any ownership over. Maybe you don't want to overwhelm them with too many graphs and dashboards and metrics. So having an account model that basically restricts the view they can see, not because you don't want them to see everything, like we still believe in transparency. They can still browse all the other systems, but at least they can go into this kind of confined view where only the stuff they care about, my microservice, my metrics, my dashboards, my alerts, that's something that most monitoring tools don't do today. So we think this is going to be a big thing for microservices and online services. Shit, I moved fast. Anyway, so basically, you know, that's pretty much a kind of summary of the key problems that we see when we go and speak to most companies today. Did most people identify with that, or? Yeah, I see lots of nods. So hopefully, after that, we gave a few solutions in there. Obviously, they're probably more to do with tools because that's where our mindset is at the moment. But hopefully, your monitoring isn't going to be a nightmare in the future, and in the future, it will be monitoring bliss. I know.